Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, of course, I thought that I would talk about my fight analysis and my fight review of the very decent fight between two of the best heavyweight contenders, and also between that of a former heavyweight champion and Mr. Andy Ruiz Jr., and also Mr. Luis Ortiz, who was a former title contender. This was a very decent matchup overall for several reasons, but in my fight prediction, I did predict Mr. Andrew Ruiz Jr. to win by unanimous decision. That is exactly what happened. Now, this fight maybe was a little bit more competitive than what I thought it was going to be, but I can't necessarily say that I am super surprised. And in this video overall, in the first part at least, I'm going to explain, why I think the fight was so competitive in certain rounds, or I'm going to explain why I think the fight occurred in the way that it did. And then overall, later on, I'm also going to explain certain narratives that you may hear and the reason why you're going to hear that, because depending on the boxing channel or depending overall on the person that you're going to hear from, they are overall going to have certain machinations as to why overall they say the things that they do, or overall they're going to have a secret narrative in play. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But anyways, just to start off with this video, overall, Mr. Andrew Ruiz Jr. was able to win by unanimous decision. I believe that all three scorecards had the fight very decently competitive, and I did as well. I thought that it was a very decently competitive fight. I believe that I personally scored the fight 6 rounds to 6. I believe all in all that the first 6 rounds I added a draw, and then of course that would mean also the last six. I believe I added 3 rounds to 3 as well. But not only did Andrew Ruiz Jr. get three separate knockdowns, I believe all in all that it was more his pace. I also believe that he was able to hurt Luis Ortiz more, obviously, because he was able to knock him down three separate times. And on top of that, when it came down to it, I just think that Andrew Ruiz is the all around better fighter. And I think that he always has been the all around better fighter. Now, Mr. Luis Ortiz, when it comes down to it, there is going to be a certain amount of people, once again, that basically say, well, if he was younger or all this sort of stuff, he probably would have beat Andrew Ruiz or he would have knocked him out. Well, that is a hypothetical, and maybe, could you have a point to that? Because, of course, heading into this fight, Mr. Luis Ortiz was 43 years old. You may have a little bit of a point. There is a little bit of truth to that. But do I believe that Luis Ortiz was really ever more skilled than the best version of Andy Ruiz Jr.? No, I do not. And I think that this fight overall somewhat proves it, even though he was a bit older. Andy Ruiz overall, the reason why I predicted him to win this fight, basically the same reason why I predicted, because when it comes down to it, the only two categories that I truly see Luis Ortiz beating Andrew Ruiz in is either punching power when it comes down to it, and maybe overall his ability to move in and out, at least with his footwork around the ring. But even Andrew Ruiz, his footwork, in my opinion, or at least his ability to move in and out, did seem to improve pretty drastically in this fight, or at least to a certain degree. So overall, that is a very, very decent improvement. Now, do I believe that Mr. Andrew Ruiz could have had more of a dominant performance? Yes, I do, even with the three knockdowns. But when it comes down to it, I can't get after him too much, because I could tell that early on in the fight that the fact that Luis Ortiz was a southpaw and also his power, that it was giving Andrew Ruiz a little bit of a problem. But overall, he could have easily lost this fight had he not known overall how to counter it. And Andrew Ruiz was able to counter it very, very decently well. He was able overall to move to his right when Luis Ortiz threw that jab. He was able to get under it. And overall, some fighters, if they stay in that position, they may get hit by a left. But then Luis Ortiz tried to hit him with the left, and Andy Ruiz overall basically switched, and he was able to hit him with a good overhand right or a right hand straight down the middle. And every single time Luis Ortiz was knocked down in this fight, it was because of a right hand, which of course does not surprise me, because against Mr. Deontay Wilder, he also was knocked down and knocked out with the right hand in both of those fights. Luis Ortiz does not avoid a right hand very decently well. And Mr. Luis Ortiz, in my view, even though a certain amount of people may say, well, he's a decent Cuban fighter and he's decent defensively, he's really not as good defensively as what some people overall would originally think. Because Mr. Luis Ortiz, especially if you notice him in this fight and also notice him against Deontay Wilder, he does have a problem overall with not covering up when certain fighters get on him on the inside, or when overall he is in certain exchanges. And not only did that cost him against Mr. Andrew Ruiz Jr. tonight, it also cost him in two separate fights against Mr. Deontay Wilder, because Deontay Wilder was able to hide a right hand overall behind the left hand, behind the left jab overall in that second fight. And in the first fight overall, when it came down to it, Luis Ortiz was knocked down a few times in that fight because when Deontay Wilder was finally able to get close to him, or when he was finally able to set up the right hand, Luis Ortiz does not keep his hands up anywhere near enough. And even sometimes when he does, he just does not have good enough head movement. It just is what it is. And that's why almost a certain amount of times when Andy was able to throw that right and get close enough to land it down the pipe, he almost landed it every single time. Luis Ortiz, once again, he's a very decent contender for the heavyweight division. But I'm not sure even at his 100% best if you're assuming that he wasn't at his best here. And I would say that he probably did lose a step if we're going to be fair. But when it comes down to it, Luis Ortiz is basically known, at least when we talk about the biggest wins in his career, for knocking out a guy by the name of Brian Jennings. And for those of you that do not remember who Brian Jennings is, Brian Jennings was a fighter that gave Vladimir Klitschko, near towards the ender part of his career, or, more the end part of his career, right before he ended up losing to Tyson Fury, I believe, actually, and Anthony Joshua. Brian Jennings was able to give Vladimir Klitschko a very tough fight in that of New York. Well, then after that, at least a couple of fights after that, I believe, he had a very tough fight against Luis Ortiz. It was a very decently competitive fight, but Luis Ortiz was able to knock him out within the 6th round. But if we really take a look at Luis Ortiz's resume and his ability, I don't think all in all that Luis Ortiz is going to be remembered, at least in my view, as someone that was a great fighter, because in my view, he's really not a great fighter. It's not that he's not a tough fighter. It's not overall that he doesn't have a lot of heart. It's not that all in all that he doesn't have some skills, but I just think that he's too limited. And I think that not only is that the reason why he lost to Mr. Andy Ruiz Jr. tonight, but I believe it's also the reason why he lost to Mr. Deontay Wilder in those 2 separate fights as well. Now, I do give him a certain amount of credit. It is not easy to beat Mr. Andy Ruiz Jr. or Deontay Wilder. You're talking about 2 former heavyweight champions of the world. But at the end of the day, there are going to be certain people that overall try to tell you that Luis Ortiz, that he was above overall, at least he was the best contender in that division overall besides the 3 main heavyweights, being overall, Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury, and Deontay Wilder. And do I necessarily agree with that? No, I do not. Overall, Luis Ortiz was never at one point in time a heavyweight champion within that division for a reason. Now some people may say, well, he was avoided by certain fighters. Well, you can mention that all you want to. But at the end of the day, Luis Ortiz, in my view, once again, I think that he's a decent fighter, but I do not believe him overall to be, top 5 of that era. I just don't believe him to be. I think that Andrew Ruiz Jr. is better than him. I think that you can debate that Joseph Parker was debatably better than him when it comes down to it. And there may even be a couple of others that I'm personally missing. And of course, I also, forgot about Mr. Dillian White. And we really did, do have to ask ourselves the question, if Luis Ortiz even was at his best, would he really beat any of those fighters? I'm not really 100% sure about that. It's possible, because in my opinion, Luis Ortiz is about on those same guys' level. But Luis Ortiz was never, ever going to beat, in my opinion, an Anthony Joshua or a Tyson Fury or even a Deontay Wilder. I don't think that he would beat any of those fighters. It's not that he's not a good fighter, but he's not a great one. It just is what it is. Now, Mr. Andy Ruiz, when it comes down to it, in my view, I don't necessarily think that he's the most skilled fighter that I've ever seen, but I do believe that he is more skilled than that of a Luis Ortiz. It just is what it is. And I think that his hand speed, I think that his better head movement, I think that his all-around better defense, at least at times, and also the fact that he has a better chin and great hand speed on the inside, I think that's what won him the fight. Once again, Luis Ortiz has a very tough time overall, not only with right hands, but when it comes down to if you're able to get on the inside with him, sometimes he will get caught slacking or lacking. Sometimes he will not keep his hands up when he needs to. He relies a lot on that reach when it comes down to it, and he relied a lot on his size, and that is a big part of the reason why he got knocked down 3 separate times in this fight. Because when Andrew Ruiz was able to get in there, and when he unloaded that right hand, it knocked him down almost every single time. Almost every single time. Because Luis Ortiz overall, he was not going to be able to compete with Mr. Andrew Ruiz on the inside. And that ended up getting him knocked down 3 separate occasions within this fight. In my view, if Luis Ortiz was going to win a rematch, or if he was going to win this fight, he had to move a little bit more in and out when it came down to it. I think that Luis Ortiz believes that he's a little bit better than what he actually is when it comes down to it. And that's not me trying to insult him, but it just is what it is. His defense does lack a little bit on the inside, and you can catch him getting lazy. You can catch him overall getting, a little bit too laxed. And that's what happened with Deontay Wilder. It's also what happened here. Just is what it is. But Mr. Andrew Ruiz, in my view, I think that he did a very decent job in this fight. It was a little bit more competitive than what I predicted. Once again, I agree with the two judges that scored it 114 to 111. Because the reason for that is because I scored it as well 6 rounds to 6. I thought Andrew Ruiz Jr., you can debate that maybe he won 7 rounds or 6 rounds. Luis Ortiz, there may be some people out there that would debate that he won 7 rounds, but I'm not really sure if I can quite agree with that. I think that Andy did a little bit too much in the fight, in my view, and hurt him a little bit too often and landed a little bit too much for me to give Luis Ortiz any more than 6 or 5 rounds in the fight. But, it was a very competitive fight. I give a certain amount of credit to both fighters. They put overall everything they had on the line. Now, the big question is, what is next for these gentlemen? For Mr. Luis Ortiz, we will see what happens with him. Even at 43 years of age, he stated that he wants to continue fighting. Do I believe that he's going to beat any of the other top contenders? It's possible, but I don't see him beating Andrew Ruiz. I think that Andrew Ruiz overall is within that top 5 range. I think number 1 is Fury. And then number 2 right now, you probably would have to debate Mr. Alexander Usyk. And then when you talk about the number 3 and 4 spot, it's pretty much interchangeable in my view between Mr. Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua. And right after that, in my view, is Mr. Andrew Ruiz, because I probably would just put him above Mr. Dillian Whyte, even though Dillian Whyte is a decent fighter. But Andrew Ruiz is the only other fighter of this generation that can claim, besides Joshua, Fury, Klitschko, and Wilder overall, and Usyk, he's the only fighter of that division that can claim that he was a legitimate champion. So Mr. Andrew Ruiz, when it came down to it, that's one thing that he can claim about himself. I do believe that he has separated himself from the mold of the Luis Ortizes and from the Joseph Parkers, at least debatably, and overall the Joe Joyces, at least at the moment, and the Dillian Whytes. Well, Joe Joyce, we'll have to see because he hasn't really had a certain amount of big fights at the moment. But we'll see what happens, at least against the super duper top contenders. But overall, when it comes down to it, congratulations to Mr. Andy Ruiz Jr. What fight would I like to see Andy in next? Well, there's a certain amount of fights that I would like to see Andy Ruiz Jr. in next. Now, apparently this was a WBC title eliminator. I would like to see whoever the winner of the Alexander Usyk versus Tyson Fury fight is, and I would like to see that winner face Mr. Andrew Ruiz Jr. I would love to see a Tyson Fury versus Andrew Ruiz Jr. fight. I also would love to see an Alexander Usyk versus Andrew Ruiz Jr. fight. I also would love to see an Andrew Ruiz Jr. versus Deontay Wilder fight. That would be a very great fight. And some may even want to see an Anthony Joshua versus Andrew Ruiz Jr. trilogy. There really is a great amount of fights for Mr. Andrew Ruiz on the table, and he is very decently skilled. Now, do I believe that he has certain improvements to make? Yes, I think all in all that, maybe his defense could get a little bit better, even though I don't think his defense is necessarily bad. But I do think all in all that he got hit a little bit too much for comfort, at least in my view, in this fight. And he does need to work on overall shooting that jab, in my opinion, a little bit more down the pipe, being a little bit more active. Because had that been another fighter, he could have potentially lost the fight just overall on not being active enough. Because we do remember in that first fight against Joseph Parker, even though you could debate that maybe Andrew Ruiz won that fight, a lot of people would argue overall that he did lose that fight because he was not active enough. So in these certain fights, he is going to have to go in there. He is going to have to risk it. Now, I thought that he did that a little bit against Luis Ortiz when it came down to it, but he's going to have to do it even a little bit more and get a little bit better with his defense, because if he faces Deontay Wilder or some of these other fighters, it may not be quite enough, but we'll see what happens. It should be very decently interesting. But anyways, that's really about it for today. The last point overall that I'll make once again about the things is that, once again, you are going to hear certain channels that say, well, had this fight been 5 years ago, Luis Ortiz probably would have won the fight, no problem. The reason why you're mainly going to hear those channels say that is because those channels are mainly Deontay Wilder fans. And they want to make it seem like Deontay Wilder was, if he's not the best heavyweight of his generation, that all in all, that he is at least the second best. Because they are going to try to argue him over Usyk. They are going to try to argue him over Mr. Anthony Joshua. Would I put him as the second best heavyweight of this generation? No, I don't think I can do that. Usyk overall has that win over AJ. And I'm not really even 100% sure if I would rank Deontay Wilder over Mr. AJ Anthony Joshua, at least in terms of a career. So that is the main reason why you're going to hear a certain amount of people all in all, especially like Aki TV or Dante's Boxing Nation, claim, well, overall, could you imagine if this fight was 5 years ago, Ortiz would have destroyed him? The reason why that is because even though they may not claim it, they have a horse in this race. They wanted Ortiz to win this fight because they always tried to make it seem that Ortiz overall, when Deontay Wilder was having that war with Joshua and also with Fury and a certain amount of others, they always wanted to make it seem like Deontay Wilder was facing the best level of competition. And don't get me wrong, I thought that the Luis Ortiz one was a very decent fight, but a lot of his other fights, in my opinion, they were not against very high grade level fighters. Not saying every single one of those was his fault, but it just is what it is. But if Deontay Wilder is going to be remembered as the second best heavyweight of the generation, either A, in my view, he's going to have to defeat Mr. Alexander Usyk, or B, he's going to have to defeat Mr. AJ Anthony Joshua. He would just have to do that. It is what it is. Or maybe knock out Mr. Andrew Ruiz. If he's able to beat Andrew Ruiz, maybe you could claim it. Maybe. Or at least third. But, that's going to be a very interesting conversation. But I just thought that I would talk about that because that is the reason why you're going to hear certain people talk the way that they do about this fight, especially about Mr. Luis Ortiz. But anyways, and don't get me wrong, he was older, but that is the reason why you're going to hear those channels say that. But anyways, very good fight. Very good performance, at least in certain degrees, by Mr. Andrew Ruiz. Thought maybe he could have been a little bit better. But overall, for the tricky southpaw that Mr. Luis Ortiz can be, and the power that he has and the athleticism that he has, even at 43 years of age, I thought all in all that it was a decent performance. He was able to get 3 separate knockdowns, and of course he was able to win by unanimous decision, which is pretty much what I predicted. So congratulations to Mr. Andrew Ruiz. Should be very interesting to see where he goes from here. He very well may get his title shot, and we'll have to see what he does. I would love to see him versus any one of the top contenders or any one of the former or current champions in the heavyweight division. Would love to see him fight those guys. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.